They were the harbingers of death and destruction throughout the Pacific theater. The bane of the United States Navy, and how Japan murdered the forces of China and most of Southeast Asia. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan's renowned World War II fighter plane, earned an unrivaled reputation during its service life, thanks not only to its cutting-edge design, but also to the smart, passionate pilots who flew it into battle. During its 5 years of duty, the Zero left an indelible mark on the Pacific War, casting a hated and ruthlessly effective spectre over every battlefield it touched. And toward the end of the war, it would add a new level to its reputation, that of a kamikaze plane, a suicide craft laden with explosives that was purposefully destroyed in the name of the Emperor. The Japanese learned rapidly. Starting in 1932, several aircraft design teams were formed. These teams would develop the aircraft that Japan would utilize to devastating effect during World War II. The Mitsubishi Type 96 bomber exemplifies Japan's success in manufacturing innovative aircraft. In August 1937, the Japanese Navy flew its new twin-engine bomber, one 250 miles over the ocean, to attack Chinese sites. This flight exceeded the capability of any operational bomber in the world at the time. Japan, like its Axis partner Germany, caught the wave of aircraft development at the appropriate time. From 1935 to 1938, Japan developed the requirements for the majority of the aircraft it would use to compete with Western nations. The Japanese military has very particular design goals for its aircraft. The Navy emphasized maneuverability and extended range in its fighters. Long range and bomb load were critical considerations for the Navy's bombers. Speed was a significant concern, but it came second to the other needs. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber had its first flight in January 1938. Its allied codename was Val. It was an all-metal low-wing monoplane powered by a radial engine producing 840 horsepower. Its top speed was 240 miles per hour. It had a range of 915 miles. The Val outperformed America's similar aircraft, the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The Dauntless made its first flight on May 1, 1940, more than 2 years after the Val. Both were comfortable to fly and simple to maintain. The Mitsubishi G4M1. Betty made its first flight on October 23, 1939. It was the medium bomber with which Japan went to war and with which the surrender teams flew to Iwo Jima. It was a lovely airplane with two 1,500 horsepower radial engines. It had a top speed of 266 miles per hour and an incredible range of 3,256 miles. The North American B-25 Mitchell was the American counterpart to the G4M. It was heavier, faster, and could carry more bombs but over shorter distances. With a 3,000-pound bomb load, it could only travel 1,500 miles. The Mitchell was far more heavily armed and armored than the Betty in its range, while shorter was enough for the island-hopping war it would participate in. By far the best-known Japanese fighter was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. It was constructed in greater numbers and operated longer and more extensively than any other Japanese warplane. The A6M2 model, which would assault Pearl Harbor, had a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour. It weighed just 313 pounds, fully loaded, a key factor in its legendary performance. To achieve this, Japanese engineers made a critical trade-off. They omitted armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. This design philosophy made the Zero exceptionally agile, but also extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. It was powered by a 940 horsepower Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine and armed with a potent combination of two 7.7 millimeters machine guns in the cowl and two powerful 20 millimeters cannons in the wings. Its most significant advantage, however, was its phenomenal range of over 1,900 miles, with a drop tank allowing it to escort bombers on long-range missions far beyond the reach of early Allied fighters. Allied pilots were stunned by its agility. Early in the conflict, Japanese pilots frequently demonstrated their skill by performing aerobatics during dogfights. The P-40 Warhawk was one of the Zero's most well-known early war opponents. The P-40 was heavier than the Zero, but somewhat faster and much more robustly built. Another was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It was also heavier than the Zero, just as quick, but less agile. Critically, it was quite strong. In the early war, a turning dogfight with the Zero proved to be a suicide mission for American pilots. Consequently, P-40 and Wildcat pilots developed new boom and zoom tactics to allow their heavy 50 caliber machine guns to cut through the lightly built A6M2s. Japan embraced the concept of small, cost-effective air forces manned by the most skilled personnel available. The excellence of these crews was achieved at a high human cost, both in training and combat. All Japanese Army training was predicated on a violent and degrading procedure. It transformed recruits into automatons, then into killers. They learned to see their foes as racially inferior and thus deserving of any mistreatment, including mass murder. The training for Air Force programs was no less rigorous, resulting in a tiny elite force of aggressive, well-trained pilots, but at a significant expense in terms of personnel and equipment. In the pre-war years, the failure rate among trainee pilots was so high that the number of graduates was limited to a few hundred per year. The structure also discouraged individual initiative. This became important later on, when the loss of a leader in a dogfight caused disarray in a Japanese unit. Japan felt that it could save money on air power, since it always controlled the scale of the combat. Like Germany, it would discover to its dismay that there is nothing more expensive than a second-best air force. Japan had only 2 years' worth of oil in reserve. It couldn't allow its supplies to fall below this level without significantly reducing its naval capabilities. Japan decided to act. The German Vichy administration in France had previously permitted Japan to assume control of the French Empire in Indochina. Japan now sought Siam, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Philippines, and a chain of islands stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. This new dominion would ensure Japan's oil supplies. With its oil supplies secure, the Japanese fleet could defend the new empire until Great Britain and the United States agreed to negotiate a peace treaty. The Japanese Navy was once fairly conservative. Its war exercises were predicated on enticing the United States fleet into Japanese waters and reducing its strength through submarine operations. The finale of these war scenarios was a massive fleet engagement in which Japanese battleships sank the adversary. In contrast, Japan's army was radical. It demanded expansion in China. From 1937 on, it became more active in the conflict against China. When General Hideki Tojo became prime minister in October 1941, he emphasized the army's power. Inter-service rivalry eroded the Navy's conservatism over time. The Navy developed a desire to wage its war sailing south to drive European colonial powers out of their holdings. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, one of the most brilliant minds in the Japanese Navy, remained conservative. He was certain that Japan could not defeat the Anglo-Saxon nations. Yamamoto also believed that it was time for Japan to take the lead in Asia. Following World War I, Yamamoto launched a mission to build carriers and acquire the greatest naval aircraft. He was successful in obtaining approval for a distinct fleet of aircraft carriers, in addition to the standard combat fleet. Yamamoto believed that if there were to be a war, it should begin with a surprise strike on the American Navy at Pearl Harbor. He ensured that he was given charge of this operation and began gathering the battleship's planes and leaders required to carry it out. He was not interested in invading. He saw United States aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers as the primary objectives. With the American fleet destroyed, the flank of Japanese expansion in the southeast would be safe for a while. On November 26, 1941, the carrier task force departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kurils. Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, the task force commander, had no prior expertise with air operations. He opposed the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was afraid that the Navy was wasting 20 years of planning by risking all on a single attack. But his pilots were enthusiastic. They had over 800 hours of flying experience on average. There were 31 ships, including 6 aircraft carriers. There were 2 battleships and 3 cruisers. The balance of the fleet was comprised of destroyers and tankers. In Washington, President Roosevelt and his aides were aware that war was imminent. They expected the impact to fall on the Philippines and Malaysia. The Japanese diplomatic code had been broken in the summer of 1940, but there was a delay in deciphering and translating the code into English. The military institution exuded an aura of business as usual. In Hawaii, life was simple, especially on weekends. There was widespread doubt at all levels that Japan would strike Pearl Harbor. On the eve of the attack, Japan's principal targets, the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Lexington, departed, taking with them the bulk of the Navy's fighting force. The order to attack was handed to the Japanese task force on December 7th. Admiral Nagumo maneuvered to a launch location 200 miles north of Oahu. At 0600 on December 7th, the Japanese initial strike force of 183 aircraft took off. 39 fighters would remain with the carriers for defense. 42 fighters were assigned to maintain air superiority and strafe targets of opportunity. There were 52 Aichi-Val dive bombers. There were 89 Nakajima B-FN Kates. The Kate was the world's most advanced torpedo plane at the time. It was a low-winged, all-metal monoplane that appeared sleek and powerful like an aerial samurai sword. By 0645, all of the United States radar stations had picked up targets heading south, barely 35 miles from Oahu. The warnings were dismissed. It was assumed either United States planes were returning or a flight of B-17s was scheduled to arrive that morning. To prevent sabotage, the United States Army has neatly arranged its planes at Wheeler Field. It was an ideal target for the Val dive bombers. Kate torpedo planes bore down on Battleship Row from the east. Another wave of Kates approached from the west in a coordinated attack against battleships and cruisers. The Zeros strafed targets of opportunity. The chaos on the ground erupted into a wave of horror. A radio broadcast got out. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. The predicted flight of B-17s also arrived. The Zeros moved in. They shot down 1 and severely damaged 3. 49 level bombers arrived, each carrying a single 1,700-pound bomb. They landed pinpoint hits on Arizona, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, and Maryland. Dive bombers continued to target hangars and other fixed sites. Zeros focused on strafing parked aircraft. Only 1 Zero was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. The American 47th Pursuit Squadron had not yet received a hit. At 0815, 5 young lieutenants launched a series of sorties that would endure until 1000. They landed and refueled, taking whichever aircraft was ready to fly either Curtiss P-40s or P-36s. The pilots had little trouble locating the enemy. At 0850, the second attack group hit flying along Oahu's east side and focusing on the same targets. The attacks on the Ford Island ships and Pearl Harbor were repeated with 78 valves. The destruction was devastating. 5 battleships were sunk. Even in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, 2 of them were unsalvageable. 3 other battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers were severely damaged. The casualties were high. 403 people were murdered and 178 were injured. Japanese intelligence officials assessed their damage. They lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and a fleet submarine. Admiral Nagumo chose to retreat satisfied with the damage he had caused and hesitant to risk his fleet in a counterattack. Technically, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a superb military strategy. It was meticulously planned and flawlessly performed. It accomplished everything it could, given that the American aircraft carriers were not in port. It also protected the tremendous thrust being made to the south. However, it proved strategically catastrophic for the Japanese Empire. It led Japan into a war it could never win. In America, the attack changed the country. It eliminated any doubt about entering the war. It silenced isolationists and America First supporters who wanted to keep the United States out of the war at any cost. Far away, on the western border of the Pacific, the Japanese planned another attack to coincide with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The raid on the island of Formosa involved a wide range of aircraft types. They included G-3M Nels, G-4M, Betty's Kai-21 Sallies, and Zero fighters. On the morning of December 8th, the Japanese launched a series of attacks on the Philippines. Any one of these attacks should have prompted an offensive reaction from General Douglas MacArthur's command. But none came. Japanese bomber and fighter formations arrived at Clark Field in the Philippines just as a massive assembly of American fighters and bombers was refueling. The Japanese, who had anticipated fierce opposition, couldn't believe their luck. The attack went just as smoothly as Pearl Harbor. The Japanese carried out a day of hard and determined air-to-air and air-to-ground battle. By the end of it, the American Far Eastern Air Force had been devastated. 60 fighters were destroyed. 12 B-17s had been destroyed with 2 damaged. Another 30 planes had been destroyed. The Japanese attacked radar stations and communication facilities, eroding American trust. There were some individual American wins in the days that followed, but not enough to stop the Japanese. By December 16th, it was decided to ship the remaining B-17s to Australia for future use. On December 31st, most of the remaining American fighter pilots were evacuated. They did not have any planes to travel in. The Japanese had secured overwhelming air supremacy, and their ground and naval forces responded appropriately. In the months leading up to the war, General MacArthur stated that he would defend all of the Philippines, smashing any attack on the beaches. MacArthur led a nominal army of 120,000 men. The majority of them were untrained, ill-armed militia. However, the Japanese landed 107,000 troops from their 14th Army at 3 separate invasion locations. The brutal reality of warfare against unequal odds compelled MacArthur to alter his initial defense strategy. The American and Filipino forces withdrew to protect Bataan. Bataan is a 25-mile-long and 20-mile-wide peninsula. The island fortification of Corregidor served as a basic command post. MacArthur had hoped for a swift American relief effort. He had stocked the peninsula with enough food ammo and hospitals to defend it for 6 months. More than 100,000 people poured into the region. The peninsula was also a haven for malaria mosquitoes. Both armies were quickly infected. The Japanese performed worse than the Americans. Their medical system was and would be primitive. But the Japanese soldiers won after the victory. The defenders of Bataan held out until April 9, 1942. They were unaware that the Japanese soldiers facing them were nearly fatigued and would have been unable to withstand a counterattack. Corregidor was hit by as many as 16,000 shells every day. On May 6, 1942, the fortress succumbed to an assault force. General MacArthur had already been instructed to retreat to Australia. His replacement on Corregidor, General Jonathan Wainwright, was obliged to command a general surrender across the Philippines. 30,000 American and 100,000 Filipino forces surrendered in the most humiliating loss in American history. British air opposition in Malaya was ineffective and quickly dismissed. Japanese high-level bombers launched a systematic attack against Singapore's stronghold. Dive bombers were brought in to prevent any British counterattacks. There were numerous British airfields on the Malay Peninsula, but few aircraft. Except for a few Hurricanes, those present were completely inadequate. The Japanese advanced along the Malay Peninsula, avoiding British roadblocks and using air power to neutralize any truly strong positions. They arrived with an aura of invincibility. On February 15, 1942, Singapore's 70,000-man garrison surrendered. It was the most crushing, humiliating defeat in British history. It was a huge success for the Japanese. They had only sent 35,000 soldiers into battle in the theater and had already lost about 1/3 of their force, either killed or wounded. The rest of Japan's push into Southeast Asia went the same route. Quick destruction of hostile air power, followed by a persistent ground assault. On May 20, 1942, Japan invaded the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. They had taken Wake Island, Guam, and a number of smaller islands. The Japanese Empire had expanded by 20 million square miles of territory. Yamamoto had gone crazy much faster than his most optimistic forecast. His country fell into a state of euphoria known as victory disease among more sober Japanese. The effect resembled the joyful melancholy that enveloped the German victors following their victory in the West. Time was wasted, and leaders at all levels began to prioritize awards and celebrations over the next win. During the first 6 months of 1942, the Allied aviation effort in the Pacific would be carried by two quite different forces. The first was conducted in China by Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers. The American Volunteer Corps was commonly referred to as the Flying Tigers. It first saw combat on December 20, 1941. It caused significant losses for Japanese bombers attempting to target Kunming. The Tigers were equipped with antiquated Curtiss P-40s. They were staffed by volunteers who had been freed from active duty with the regular United States troops. Claire Chennault's tactics and a crude but efficient early warning system helped the group fight the Japanese. Chennault was the Army Air Corps' rogue fighter aviation champion. He was kicked out of the service because he insisted on concepts that contradicted mainstream wisdom. He was knowledgeable about Japanese culture. He taught his pilots to always use two plane elements in hit-and-run situations. These tactics took advantage of the P-40's higher-level flying speed and much superior diving capability. The P-40s were well built. Their massive firepower shattered the flimsy Japanese warplanes. Chennault and his soldiers boosted Allied morale at a time when there was only negative news on all fronts. On July 4, 1942, the American volunteer group disbanded. Many of its members were absorbed into the United States Army Air Forces. They had built a strong heritage of flying, fighting, and winning. On April 18, 1942, a second element distinct from the Flying Tigers made an impact on the conflict. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Doolittle planned to attack Japan with 16 modified North American B-25 Mitchells, putting the crucial aircraft carrier Hornet at risk. They traveled 600 miles to hit targets in Kobe, Osaka, Nagoya, Tokyo, and Yokohama. Doolittle was fully aware that it was simply a token raid. Each B-25 had only 3 500-pound demolition bombs and 1 500-pound incendiary cluster. The goal was to shake Japan's morale while simultaneously raising America's. The raid caught everyone completely off guard. Although no B-25s were shot down, they were all lost. 15 crew members had to jump out or crash land. One plane made it to Vladivostok, where the Russians imprisoned it and the crew. 3 crew members were killed during crash landings. The Japanese seized another 8 people and tortured and interrogated them. 3 of them were used as examples. Doolittle knew he had only caused minor damage. He was confident that he would be hauled home and court-martialed for his failure. Instead, his achievement was regarded as a moral tonic. He was awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted to Brigadier General. Jimmy Doolittle's raid had another unexpected and instructive consequence. The Japanese realized that the United States fleet remained a threat and needed to be eliminated. Yamamoto understood that vigorous action was required to keep the British and American ships off balance. As part of the wider, eastward advance, Yamamoto chose to use Port Moresby, New Guinea, as a base for an attack on Australia. He planned to use Tulagi in the Solomon Islands as a staging location for future operations. The British and Americans were determined to stop the Japanese advance on Port Moresby. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz was a polite gentleman who pushed himself hard. He directed his 3 admirals, Halsey, Spruance, and Fletcher, to attack Japanese island bases with the only weapons he had: the 3 carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown. Both fleets used blind man's bluff, squandering opportunities to strike. On May 5th, scout planes from both fleets found one another. The observations served as the opening salvo in what would become a dogfight between planes. It was a historic event, the first aircraft carrier engagement in which no surface ship encountered an enemy vessel. On May 7th, American aircraft coincidentally discovered the Japanese light carrier Shoho. Douglas Dauntlesses and Devastators from the Lexington and Yorktown assaulted and sank the ship with bombs and torpedoes. An immortal radio call went out, which was promptly picked up by the media and used as a symbol of a new stage in the battle. Lieutenant Commander Dixon radioed an ecstatic, "Scratch 1 flat top, yo, it's star," back to the carrier. The Japanese counterattacked with 27 torpedo planes and level bombers. They encountered Admiral Fletcher's combat aviation patrol and lost 7 planes in a dogfight compared to 3 for the Americans. The Japanese bombers dropped their payloads into the sea. But they circled the ship Yorktown amid a hail of anti-aircraft fire and radioed back her whereabouts. 14 of the surviving Japanese planes were lost at sea as they returned to their ship. The following day, both fleets were under observation by 0815. The Americans delivered the first strike. By 0915, they had 75 planes in the sky. SBDs and Devastators found 2 Japanese carriers. 9 of the destroyers launched torpedoes. All 9 malfunctioned. However, the fearless dive bombers managed to get through the defenses and hit the Shokaku 3 times, causing it to burn. By 1100, the Japanese had launched a crushing attack on Yorktown. An 800-pound bomb penetrated 4 decks of the Yorktown, killing or injuring 66 crewmen. 2 torpedoes struck Lexington's side. She began to list and was unable to maneuver. Additional torpedoes and bombs were sent. In an impressive display of damage control, the listing Lexington was righted by transferring oil ballast. Air operations have resumed. However, as she returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs, a catastrophic aviation fuel explosion ripped the ship apart. The Lexington's Captain Frederick C. Sherman reluctantly issued an order to abandon ship. But the Lexington did not sink. The destroyer USS Phelps had to deliver the coup de grace using 5 torpedoes. Both sides suffered nearly equal losses at the Battle of the Coral Sea, with the Japanese gaining a tiny lead. However, the Japanese advance into Port Moresby was strategically halted. Yamamoto planned to push Nimitz to combat. He would lead the United States Pacific Fleet into battle and destroy it. Midway Shun, 300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, served as bait for an ingenious trap. In total, 165 ships participated in Japan's intricate plan and difficult timetable. The carrier strike force's mission was to destroy Midway Island's defenses and subsequently defeat the American Pacific Fleet. Meanwhile, the military occupation force planned to seize Midway Island and convert it into a Japanese airbase. Yamamoto headed the greatest armada ever constructed in the Pacific. However, he dispersed it so broadly that its components were vulnerable. The Japanese still thought their codes were secure. They also believed that Nimitz needed to be persuaded to fight. In truth, he was prepared to let loose. Nimitz and his staff did not have complete knowledge of the Japanese intentions. However, they had enough to implement immediate countermeasures. These included the reinforcement of Midway Island and the extraordinarily quick return of the repaired carrier Yorktown to action. The carrier strike force would consist of the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet. The carriers carried 77 Grumman F-4Fs, 112 Douglas SBDs, and 42 Douglas Devastators. In addition to the carriers, the Pacific Fleet consisted of 6 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 19 submarines. The Japanese fleet was expected to include 4 battleships, 5 carriers, 9 heavy cruisers, 5 light cruisers, 24 destroyers, and 25 submarines. Despite Japan's numerical advantage, Nimitz relied on tactical and strategic advantages. He ruled Midway. Midway was not only unsinkable, but also a magnet for Japanese bombs, deflecting them away from the Pacific Fleet. Midway boasted a robust air force. There were 32 PBY patrol flying boats. By June 4th, Nimitz had 105 aircraft on Midway, along with 141 officers and 2 886 troops. He now positioned his carriers slightly out of range of anticipated Japanese reconnaissance and waited. At the same time, American Task Force 17 was heading southwest. It arrived at a position 202 miles north of Midway, within striking reach of the Japanese fleet. It was ready for launch around 0430. Nagumo, the Japanese admiral, was unaware of the existence of American ships. He launched the initial attack on Midway with 108 planes consisting of 36 Zeros, 36 Vals, and 36 Kates configured as level bombers. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, a combined PBY had identified two of the ships and radioed their whereabouts to Midway. Aircraft erupted from the Midway runway, some to protect themselves from an attack, others to defend the island. Japanese bombers destroyed some structures and oil tanks on Midway, but their efforts were ineffective. A second attack would be required. The B-17s from Midway joined the combat. They dropped bombs from 20,000 feet. The hits they claimed were eventually discounted. A Japanese reconnaissance aircraft located the fleet at 0728, but did not report the presence of a carrier. At 0925, Lieutenant Wade McCluskey was heading a patrol of Douglas Dauntless on a fruitless search. He had arrived at the location where the Japanese fleet was expected to be, only to find an empty sea. His gasoline was running low, but he chose to continue on the same course for another 10 minutes. Then, without permission, he headed right toward the northwest. 20 minutes later, he spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi approaching the Japanese fleet. The patrol was nearly out of petrol. McCluskey understood that any of his aircraft that survived an attack on the Japanese fleet would have to ditch in the water. He didn't hesitate. He turned and followed the destroyer. SIBD Dauntless and Vought Vindicators launched ineffective strikes on the fleet from Midway. 8 SBDs were lost to the dreaded Zeros. The Dauntless and Vindicators did not cause much damage, but they kept the Japanese carriers on their toes. Another United States onslaught was on its way. 117 aircraft, including Dauntless Devastators and Wildcats from the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. It was a desperate mission, almost to the edge of the aircraft's fighting radius. At 0917, Admiral Nagumo turned to make a strike on the American Navy. His decks were cluttered with aircraft undergoing armament changes and refueling. At 0925, 8 Douglas Devastators attacked the Soyuz without a fighter escort. They flew into a barrage of anti-aircraft fire and 0 bullets. Only one plane got close enough to launch a torpedo, which had no effect. 5 minutes later, a further 14 Devastators attacked. 10 were shot down. Nonetheless, the Japanese suffered little damage. However, American aircraft forced the Japanese ships to turn to escape them. No fighters could be launched. Meanwhile, at 10:01, Wade McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers. He communicated the enemy fleet's position to the Enterprise before launching an attack with the other Dauntless. Admiral Nagumo looked up from the bridge of the Akagi and saw his worst dread. A torrent of American planes dropping from 15,000 feet and spaced 5 seconds apart. Explosions triggered a roaring fire that swept through the Kara. It sank, trapping 800 men below decks. More Dauntless arrived from the carrier Yorktown. Their intended target was the Soyuz aircraft carrier. They arranged 3 1,000-pound bombs evenly over the deck. Admiral Yamaguchi Temin led a counterattack on the American carrier Yorktown. 7 bells from Yamaguchi's carrier, Hiryu, passed through Yorktown's defenses. 3 direct blows on the Yorktown left it dead in the water and on fire. A second onslaught followed. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown. Her rudder was jammed and she was listing dramatically. But just as the attack was taking place, an Enterprise patrol spotted the Hiryu. 25 dive bombers were dispatched to strike. Within 30 minutes, another 16 were on the way. The initial bombs missed, but 3 of the remaining dive bombers penetrated her deck. On June 5th at 02:55, Admiral Yamamoto ordered his fleet to withdraw. He told his officers he would apologize to the Emperor himself. Yamamoto recognized that the first naval defeat in 350 years had turned the tide against his native country. In a matter of minutes, a few old Douglas dive bombers sank 4 aircraft carriers. They'd won the Battle of Midway. They reversed the course of the Pacific War. They destroyed the best Japanese naval aviators. They unleashed an almost frenzied wave of enthusiasm in the United States, providing new impetus and energy to the American war effort. The Battle of Midway marked not only the turning point of the war, but also the beginning of the end for the A6M Zero's dominance. The catastrophic loss of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots was a blow from which its naval air power would never recover. As the war progressed, the Zero's fatal flaws, its lack of armor and vulnerable fuel tanks, were ruthlessly exploited by new generations of powerful and robust Allied fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. Though it was upgraded, the Zero could no longer compete on equal terms. In the final desperate year of the war, its role devolved from that of a proud hunter to a tragic kamikaze weapon. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero remains an icon of aviation history, a brilliant revolutionary yet ultimately flawed design that perfectly symbolized both the stunning initial triumphs and the eventual devastating collapse of the Japanese Empire.